Chapter 21. Albert Kennedy, Bert to people he liked, lived in a room at the back of the house and was one of Mrs. Cooper's original lodgers. He was 45, a native of San Francisco, and more like a New Yorker than anyone Therese had met in the town, and this fact alone inclined her to avoid him. Often he asked Therese to go to the movies with him, but she had gone only once. She was restless, and she preferred to wander about by herself, mostly just looking and thinking because the days were too cold and windy for any outdoor sketching. And the scenes she had liked at first had grown too stale to sketch, from too much looking, too much waiting. Therese went to the library almost every evening, sat at one of the long tables looking over half a dozen books, and then took a meandering course homeward. She came back to the house only to wander out again after a while, stiffening herself against the erratic wind, or letting it turn her down streets she would not otherwise have followed. In the lighted windows, she would see a girl seated at a piano, in another, a man laughing, in another, a woman sewing. Then she remembered she could not even call Carol, admitted to herself she did not even know what Carol was doing at this moment, and she felt emptier than the wind. Carol did not tell her everything in her letters, she felt, did not tell her the worst. In the library, she looked at books with photographs of Europe in them, marble fountains in Sicily, ruins of Greece in sunlight, and she wondered if she and Carol would really ever go there. There was still so much they had not done. There was the first voyage across the Atlantic. There was simply the mornings anywhere, when she could lift her head from a pillow and see Carol's face and know that the day was theirs and that nothing would separate them. And there was the beautiful thing, transfixing the heart and the eyes at once, in the dark window of an antique shop in a street where she had never been. Therese stared at it, feeling it quench some forgotten and nameless thirst inside her. Most of its porcelain surface was painted with small bright lozenges of colored enamel, royal blue and deep red and green, outlined with coin gold, as shiny as silk embroidery, even under its film of dust. There was a gold ring at the rim for the finger. It was a tiny candlestick holder. Who had made it, she wondered, and for whom? She came back the next morning and bought it to give to Carol. A letter from Richard had come that morning, forwarded from Colorado Springs. Therese sat down on one of the stone benches in the street where the library was and opened it. It was on business stationery. The Semco Bottled Gas Company. Cooks, heats, makes ice. Richard's name was at the top, as general manager of the Port Jefferson branch. Dear Therese, I have Danny to thank for telling me where you are. You may think this letter unnecessary, and perhaps it is to you. Perhaps you are still in that fog you were when we talked that evening in the cafeteria. But I feel it is necessary to make one thing clear, and that is that I no longer feel the way I did even 2 weeks ago, and the letter I wrote you last was nothing but a last spasmodic effort, and I knew it was hopeless when I wrote it, and I knew you wouldn't answer, and I didn't want you to. I know I had stopped loving you then, and now the uppermost emotion I feel towards you is one that was present from the first, disgust. It is your hanging on to this woman to the exclusion of everyone else, this relationship which I am sure has become sordid and pathological by now, that disgusts me. I know that it will not last, as I said from the first. It is only regrettable that you will be disgusted later yourself, in proportion to how much of your life you waste now with it. It is rootless and infantile, like living on lotus blossoms or some sickening candy instead of the bread and meat of life. I have often thought of those questions you asked me the day we were flying the kite. I wish I had acted then before it was too late, because I loved you enough then to try to rescue you. Now I don't. People still ask me about you. What do you expect me to tell them? I intend to tell them the truth. Only that way can I get it out of myself, and I can no longer bear to carry it around with me. I have sent a few things you had at the house back to your apartment. The slightest memory or contact with you depresses me, makes me not want to touch you or anything concerned with you. But I am talking sense, and very likely you are not understanding a word of it. Except maybe this. I want nothing to do with you." She saw Richard's thin, soft lips, tensed in a straight line as they must have looked when he wrote the letter, a line that still did not keep the tiny taut curl in the upper lip from showing. She saw his face clearly for a moment, and then it vanished with a little jolt that seemed as muffled and remote from her as the clamor of Richard's letter. She stood up, put the letter back in the envelope, and walked on. She hoped he succeeded in purging himself of her, but she could only imagine him telling other people about her with that curious attitude of passionate participation she had seen in New York before she left. She imagined Richard telling Phil as they stood some evening at the Palermo bar, imagined him telling the Kellys. She wouldn't care at all, whatever he said. She wondered what Carol was doing now, at 10 o'clock, at 11 in New Jersey, listening to some stranger's accusations, thinking of her, or was there time for that? It was a fine day, cold and almost windless, bright with sun. She could take the car and drive somewhere. She had not used the car for 3 days. Suddenly, she realized she did not want to use it. The day she had taken it out and driven it up to 90 on the straight road to Del Rapids, exultant after a letter from Carol, seemed very long ago. Mr. Bowen, another of the roomers, was on the front porch when she came back to Mrs. Cooper's house. He was sitting in the sun, with his legs wrapped in a blanket and his cap pulled down over his eyes as if he were asleep, but he called out, "Hi there! How's my girl?" She stopped and chatted with him for a while, asked him about his arthritis, trying to be as courteous as Carol had always been with Mrs. French. They found something to laugh at, and she was still smiling when she went to her room. Then the sight of the geranium ended it. She watered the geranium and set it at the end of the windowsill, where it would get the sun for the longest time. There was even brown at the tips of the smallest leaves at the top. Carol had bought it for her in Des Moines just before she took the plane. The pot of ivy had died already. The man in the shop had warned them it was delicate, but Carol had wanted it anyway, and Therese doubted that the geranium would live. But Mrs. Cooper's motley collection of plants flourished in the bay window. "I walk and walk around the town," she wrote to Carol, "but I wish I could keep walking in one direction, east, and finally come to you. When can you come, Carol? Or shall I come to you? I really cannot stand being away from you so long." She had her answer the next morning. A check fluttered out of Carol's letter onto Mrs. Cooper's hall floor. The check was for $250. Carol's letter, the long loops, looser and lighter, the T-bars stretching the length of the word, said that it was impossible for her to come out within the next 2 weeks, if then. The check was for her to fly back to New York and have the car driven east. "I'd feel better if you took the plane. Come now and don't wait," was the last paragraph. Carol had written the letter in haste, had probably snatched a moment to write it, but there was a coldness in it, too, that shocked Therese. She went out and walked dazedly to the corner and dropped the letter she had written the night before into the mailbox anyway, a heavy letter with 3 airmail stamps on it. She might see Carol within 12 hours. The thought did not bring any reassurance. Should she leave this morning? This afternoon? What had they done to Carol? She wondered if Carol would be furious if she telephoned her, if it would precipitate some crisis into a total defeat if she did. She was sitting at a table somewhere with coffee and orange juice in front of her before she looked at the other letter in her hand. In the upper left corner, she could just make out the scrawly handwriting. It was from Mrs. R. Robichek. "Dear Therese, thank you very much for the delicious sausage that came last month. You are a nice, sweet girl, and I am glad to have the opportunity to thank you many times. It was nice of you to think of me making such a long trip. I enjoy the pretty postcards, especially the big one from Sioux Falls. How is in South Dakota? Are mountains and cowboys? I have never had chance to travel except Pennsylvania. You are a lucky girl, so young and pretty and kind. Myself, I still work. The store is just the same. Everything is the same, but it is colder. Please visit me when you come back. I cook a nice dinner for you, not from delicatessen. Thank you for the sausage again. I lived from it for many days. Really something special and nice. With best regards and yours truly. Therese slid off the stool, left some money on the counter, and ran out. She ran all the way to the Warrior Hotel, put the call in, and waited with the receiver against her ear until she heard the telephone ringing in Carol's house. No one answered. It rang 20 times, and no one answered. She thought of calling Carol's lawyer, Fred Hames. She decided she shouldn't. Neither did she want to call Abby. That day it rained, and Therese lay on her bed in her room, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for 3 o'clock, when she intended to telephone again. Mrs. Cooper brought her a tray of lunch around midday. Mrs. Cooper thought she was sick. Therese could not eat the food, however, and she did not know what to do with it. She was still trying to reach Carol at 5 o'clock. Finally, the ringing stopped, and there was confusion on the wire, a couple of operators questioning each other about the call, and the first words Therese heard from Carol were, "Yes, damn it!" Therese smiled, and the ache went out of her arms. "Hello," Carol said brusquely. "Hello?" The connection was bad. "I got the letter, the one with the check. What happened, Carol? What?" Carol's harassed-sounding voice repeated through the crackling interference. "This wire, I think, is tapped, Therese. Are you all right? Are you coming home? I can't talk very long now." Therese frowned, wordless. "Yes, I suppose I can leave today." Then she blurted, "What is it, Carol? I really can't stand this, not knowing anything." "Therese." Carol drew the word all across Therese's words, like a deletion. "Will you come home so I can talk to you?" Therese thought she heard Carol sigh impatiently. "But I've got to know now. Can you see me at all when I come back?" "Hang on to yourself, Therese." Was this the way they talked together? Were these the words they used? "But can you?" "I don't know," Carol said. A chill ran up her arm into the fingers that held the telephone. She felt Carol hated her, because it was her fault, her stupid blunder about the letter Florence had found. Something had happened, and perhaps Carol couldn't and wouldn't even want to see her again. "Has the court thing started yet?" "It's finished. I wrote you about that. I can't talk any longer. Goodbye, Therese." Carol waited for her to reply. "I've got to say goodbye." Therese put the receiver slowly back on the hook. She stood in the hotel lobby, staring at the blurred figures around the front desk. She pulled Carol's letter out of her pocket and read it again, but Carol's voice was closer, saying impatiently, "Will you come home so I can talk to you?" She pulled the check out and looked at it again upside down, and slowly tore it up. She dropped the pieces into a brass spittoon. But the tears did not come until she got back to the house and saw her room again, the double bed that sagged in the middle, the stack of letters from Carol on the desk. She couldn't stay here another night. She would go to a hotel for the night, and if the letter Carol had mentioned wasn't here tomorrow morning, she would leave anyway. Therese dragged her suitcase down from the closet and opened it on the bed. The folded corner of a white handkerchief stuck out of one of the pockets. Therese took it out and lifted it to her nose, remembering the morning in Des Moines when Carol had put it there, with the dash of perfume on it, and the derisive remark Carol had made about putting it there, which she had laughed at. Therese stood with her hand on the back of a chair and the other hand clenched in a fist that rose and fell aimlessly, and what she felt was as blurred as the desk and the letters that she frowned at in front of her. Then her hand reached out suddenly for the letter propped against the books at the back of the desk. She hadn't seen the letter before, though it was in plain view. Therese tore it open. This was the letter Carol had meant. It was a long letter, and the ink was pale blue on some pages and dark on others, and there were words crossed out. She read the first page, then went back and read it again. "My darling, I am not even going into court. This morning I was given a private showing of what Harge intended to bring against me. Yes, they have a few conversations recorded, namely Waterloo, and it would be useless to try to face a court with this. I should be ashamed, not for myself, oddly enough, but for my own child, to say nothing of not wanting you to have to appear. Everything was very simple this morning. I simply surrendered. The important thing now is what I intend to do in the future, the lawyers said. On this depends whether I would ever see my child again, because Harge has with ease now complete custody of her. The question was, would I stop seeing you, and others like you, they said. It was not so clearly put. There were a dozen faces that opened their mouths and spoke like the judges of doomsday, reminding me of my duties, my position, and my future. What future have they fixed up for me? Are they going to look in on it in 6 months? I said I would stop seeing you. I wonder if you will understand, Therese, since you are so young and never even knew a mother who cared desperately for you. For this promise, they present me with their wonderful reward, the privilege of seeing my child a few weeks of the year. Hours later. Abby is here. We talk of you. She sends you her love, as I send mine. Abby reminds me of the things I know already, that you are very young, and you adore me. Abby does not think I should send this to you, but tell you when you come. We have just had quite an argument about it. I tell her she does not know you as well as I, and I think now she does not know me as well as you in some ways, and those ways are the emotions. I am not very happy today, my sweet. I am drinking my ryes, and you would tell me they depress me, I know. But I wasn't prepared for these days after those weeks with you. They were happy weeks. You knew it more than I did. Though all we have known is only a beginning. I meant to try to tell you in this letter that you don't even know the rest, and perhaps you never will, and are not supposed to, meaning destined to. We never fought, never came back knowing there was nothing else we wanted in heaven or hell but to be together. Did you ever care for me that much? I don't know. But that is all part of it, and all we have known is only a beginning. And it has been such a short time. For that reason, it will have shorter roots in you. You say you love me, however I am, and when I curse, I say I love you always, the person you are, and the person you will become. I would say it in a court if it would mean anything to those people, or possibly change anything, because those are not the words I am afraid of. I mean, darling, I shall send you this letter, and I think you will understand why I do, why I told the lawyers yesterday I would not see you again, and why I had to tell them that. And I would be underestimating you to think you could not, and to think you would prefer delay. She stopped reading and stood up, and walked slowly to her writing table. Yes, she understood why Carol had sent the letter, because Carol loved her child more than her, and because of that the lawyers had been able to break her, to force her to do exactly what they wanted her to do. Therese could not imagine Carol forced. Yet here it was, in Carol's writing. It was a surrender, Therese knew. No situation in which she was the stake could have wrested from Carol. For an instant there came the fantastic realization that Carol had devoted only a fraction of herself to her, Therese, and suddenly the whole world of the last month, like a tremendous lie, cracked and almost toppled. In the next instant, Therese did not believe that. Yet the fact remained. She had chosen her child. She stared at Richard's envelope on her table and felt all the words she wanted to say to him, that she had never said to him, rising in a torrent inside her. What right had he to talk about whom she loved or how? What did he know about her? What had he ever known? Exaggerated, and at the same time minimized, she read on another page of Carol's letter. But between the pleasure of a kiss and of what a man and woman do in bed seems to me only a gradation. A kiss, for instance, is not to be minimized, or its value judged by anyone else, I wonder, do these men grade their pleasure in terms of whether their actions produce a child or not, and do they consider them more pleasant if they do? It is a question of pleasure, after all. And what's the use debating the pleasure of an ice cream cone versus a football game, or a Beethoven quartet versus the Mona Lisa? I'll leave that to the philosophers. But their attitude was that I must be somehow demented or blind, plus a kind of regret, I thought, at the fact a fairly attractive woman is presumably unavailable to men. Someone brought aesthetics into the argument. I mean against me, of course. I said, did they really want to debate that? It brought the only laugh in the whole show. But the most important point I did not mention, and was not thought of by anyone, that the rapport between two men or two women can be absolute and perfect, as it can never be between man and woman, and perhaps some people want just this, as others want that more shifting and uncertain thing that happens between men and women. It was said, or at least implied yesterday, that my present course would bring me to the depths of human vice and degeneration. Yes, I have sunk a good deal since they took you from me. It is true. If I were to go on like this and be spied upon, attacked, never possessing one person long enough so that knowledge of a person is a superficial thing, that is degeneration. Or to live against one's grain. That is degeneration by definition. Darling, I pour all this out to you. The next lines were crossed out. You will undoubtedly handle your future better than I. Let me be a bad example to you. If you are hurt now, beyond what you think you can bear, and if it makes you, either now or one day, hate me, and this is what I told Abby, then I shan't be sorry. I may have been that one person you were fated to meet, as you say, and the only one, and you can put it all behind you. Yet if you don't, for all this failure and the dismalness now, I know what you said that afternoon is right. It needn't be like this. I do want to talk with you once when you come back, if you're willing, unless you think you can't. Your plants are still thriving on the back porch. I water them every day. Therese could not read any more. Beyond her door she heard footsteps slowly descending the stairs, walking more confidently across the hall. When the footsteps were gone, she opened her door and stood there a moment, struggling against an impulse to walk straight out of the house and leave everything behind her. Then she went down the hall to Mrs. Cooper's door in the rear. Mrs. Cooper answered her knock, and Therese said the words she had prepared about leaving that night. She watched Mrs. Cooper's face that didn't listen to her, but only reacted to the sight of her own face, and Mrs. Cooper seemed suddenly her own reflection, which she could not turn away from. "Well, I'm sorry, Miss Bellivet. I'm sorry if your plans have gone wrong," she said, while her face registered only shock and curiosity. Then Therese went back to her room and began to pack, laying in the bottom of her suitcase the cardboard models she had folded flat, and then her books. After a moment she heard Mrs. Cooper approaching her door slowly, as if she carried something, and Therese thought if she was bringing her another tray she would scream. Mrs. Cooper knocked. "Where shall I forward your mail to, honey, in case there's any more letters?" Mrs. Cooper asked. "I don't know yet. I'll have to write and let you know." Therese felt light-headed and sickish when she straightened up. "You're not starting back for New York this late at night, are you?" Mrs. Cooper called anything after 6, night. "No," Therese said. "I'll just go a little ways." She was impatient to be alone. She looked at Mrs. Cooper's hand, bulging the gray checked apron under the waistband, at the cracked, soft house shoes worn paper-thin on these floors, which had walked these floors years before she came here and would go on in the same foot tracks years after she was gone. "Well, you be sure and let me hear how you make out," Mrs. Cooper said. "Yes." She drove to an hotel, a different hotel from the one where she had always called Carol. Then she went out for a walk, restlessly, avoiding all the streets she had been in with Carol. She might have driven to another town, she thought, and stopped, half decided to go back to the car. Then she walked on, not caring, actually, where she was. She walked until she was cold, and the library was the closest place to go and get warm. She passed the diner and glanced in. Dutch saw her, and with the familiar dip of his head, as if he had to look under something to see her through the window, he smiled and waved to her. Automatically, her hand waved back, goodbye. And suddenly she thought of her room in New York, with the dress still on the studio couch, and the corner of the carpet turned back. If she could only reach out now and pull the carpet flat, she thought. She stood staring down the narrowish, solid-looking avenue with its round streetlights. A single figure walked along the sidewalk towards her. Therese went up the library steps. Miss Graham, the librarian, greeted her as usual, but Therese did not go into the main reading room. There were 2 or 3 people there tonight, the bald-headed man with the black-rimmed glasses, who was often at the middle table, and how often had she sat in that room with a letter from Carol in her pocket. With Carol beside her. She climbed the stairs, past the history and art room on the 2nd floor, up to the 3rd floor where she had never been before. There was a single large, dusty-looking room with glass front bookcases around the walls, a few oil paintings, and marble busts on pedestals. Therese sat down at one of the tables, and her body relaxed with an ache. She put her head down on her arms on the table, suddenly limp and sleepy, but in the next second she slid the chair back and stood up. She felt prickles of terror in the roots of her hair. She had been somehow pretending until this moment that Carol was not gone, that when she went back to New York she would see Carol and everything would have to be, as it had been before. She glanced nervously around the room, as if looking for some contradiction, some redress. For a moment she felt her body might shatter a part of itself, or might hurl itself through the glass of the long windows across the room. She stared at a pallid bust of Homer, the inquisitively lifted eyebrows delineated faintly by dust. She turned to the door, and for the first time noticed the picture over the lintel. It was only similar, she thought. Not quite the same. Not the same. But the recognition had shaken her at the core, was growing as she looked at it, and she knew the picture was exactly the same, only much larger, and she had seen it many times in the hall that led to the music room, before they had taken it down when she was still small. The smiling woman in the ornate dress of some court, the hand poised just below the throat, the arrogant head half-turned, as if the painter had somehow caught her in motion, so that even the pearls that hung from each ear seemed to move. She knew the short, firmly modeled cheeks, the full, coral lips that smiled at one corner, the mockingly narrowed lids, the strong, not very high forehead, that even in the picture seemed to project a little over the living eyes that knew everything beforehand, and sympathized and laughed at once. It was Carol. Now, in the long moment while she could not look away from it, the mouth smiled, and the eyes regarded her with nothing but mockery. The last veil lifted, and revealing nothing but mockery and gloating, the splendid satisfaction of the betrayal accomplished. With a shuddering gasp, Therese ran under the picture and down the stairs. In the downstairs hall, Miss Graham said something to her, an anxious question, and Therese heard her own reply like an idiot's babble, because she was still gasping, fighting for breath, and she passed Miss Graham and rushed out of the building.